You ready to go? Yep. All right. Okay. Here we go. So, Union of Uzhhorod, this year is the 380th anniversary of the Union, which took place in the town of Uzhhorod, which is now in Ukraine. And just a little bit of background on our church, especially for when you're trying to explain to somebody. Our mother church is Constantinople. In the 9th century, the Prince of Great Moravia asked for missionaries to come to his kingdom from the Eastern Roman Empire. This is what Hagia Sophia looked like before the Muslims built the minarets around it. So that's the mother church for our mother diocese, the Eparchy of Mukachevo. Okay, next one. All right, so why a union? Why? Because we need one church. And this is the big scandal for non-Christians, is that we are so divided. In the Gospel of St. John, our Lord says, I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I must bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. So the whole idea is rooted in Scripture. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. Now that first sentence was inscribed on a banner at St. Louis de Francais Roman Catholic Church in Moscow. And they had it right up by the high altar. Thou art Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not prevail against it. All right, the whole Petrine office. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. All right, this is the whole thing of the primacy of the Pope and the role of the Pope as the successor to St. Peter, as the head of the united church. And then, of course, in the Divine Liturgy, we're always praying for the stability of the holy churches of God and for the union of all. Let us pray to the Lord. Right? So in the Byzantine Rite, we constantly are praying for this to happen, right? For unity to be restored. Okay. All right, so how did the great church get shattered? All right, the Church of the Roman Empire starts experiencing schisms once they have to define various doctrines. So the Council of Ephesus in 431 defined Our Lady as the Mother of God, the Theotokos. And that, after Ephesus, the Church of the East split by itself. It was within the Persian Empire, and mostly linguistic problems, and also the fact that they were in a country where the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire were always at war. Chalcedon 451, this is when the church defines that Jesus has two natures in one person, right? And that's why when we bless ourselves with 3 fingers up, we have 2 fingers down next to each other for the two natures in one person. You didn't know that, eh? So that's why we do what we do. Everything we do has a purpose. So after Chalcedon, then we have a major schism in Egypt and Syria, modern Iraq, that really shatters the church within the empire. And then there's all the controversies between Rome and Constantinople, which led to different breaks. 1054 is not the actual date of schism. 1054 is when there was a big argument between Rome and Constantinople. But communion was maintained for a long time. It's after the Fourth Crusade in 1204. That's when you have the split between Latin and Greek churches really hardening. And a good example of this is when there was a young man, he and his brother were the sons of a Greek Orthodox man and a German Roman Catholic mother. The boys went to Greece to stay the summer with their grandfather, who was a Greek Orthodox priest. When they came back, they came up to me and they said, Father, when was the Fourth Crusade? And I said, 1204, why? And they said, according to our grandparents, it was a few weeks before we got there. The feelings were so hardened right, between East and West. And that's the split of the church in Europe into what is now called Catholic and Orthodox. And then in the 16th century, absolute chaos is unleashed in Western Europe and Central Europe by the Reformation. Right? Luther breaks with Rome, Calvin breaks with Luther, and so forth. And you have this multiplication of churches that we have now today. There's 42,000 different Christian denominations in the world today. Okay. So, how therefore do we fulfill Christ's prayer for all to be one? So there were repeated efforts from Rome and from some of the Eastern churches trying to achieve communion again between the Eastern churches, some of them at least, and the See of Peter. The ones that remained in unbroken communion with the Holy See are the Maronites, who were isolated in Mount Lebanon territory until the Crusaders came in 1182. But as soon as the Crusaders came, one of the first questions the Maronites asked them was, who is the current pope? Right? So although they had no direct link with the Holy See, spiritually they had maintained that link. And the Italo-Greeks, those are the Byzantine Rite parishes in southern Italy and Sicily that have remained in unbroken communion. So the goal of the popes was to establish reunion with each particular self-governing Eastern church. It only succeeded with ours. We're the only one, the Ruthenian, where the entire church is restored to communion with Rome. Okay. So, this council was called in order to achieve unification between the Latin Church and the Greek Church. The Eastern Roman Empire by this point was sharply declining, limited to just a few places in modern Turkey, Constantinople itself, and in Greece. And they needed aid from the West in order to save the empire from the Turks. So the Council of Florence was called. It took place over 4 years. And they, I said 4 years, from 31 to 45. The reunion was proclaimed in 1439. And the Greek Orthodox accepted these points. The primacy of the Pope as the successor of St. Peter, that the Pope holds the heritage of Peter, right, as a teacher and as a definer for faith, especially and definer, the arbitrator for any conflict between churches. The validity of Latin practices. Many Greek clergy had denounced practices in the Latin church. Unleavened bread for the host, use of the filioque in the creed. Now they accepted those as being valid. Right? They didn't incorporate it into the Greek church, but that the Latin practices were valid. The existence of purgatory, but not purification by fire. That is still shown a lot in Western-style holy pictures, where you see the souls in purgatory being consumed by fire. But Florence makes it very clear, right? Fire is reserved for the souls in hell, not purgatory. Purgatory is for purification, period. And the Greeks would keep their liturgical and spiritual life intact. Nothing would change. That's really important for the East, and it's really important for our Union of Uzhhorod. What they did not settle was how much authority would the Pope have over the entire church. The various popes were claiming not just universal jurisdiction, but universal authority, that they could go into a church and replace bishops. And that never got settled. They did agree on the primacy, that he's first, right, as the See of Peter. But how is the primacy to be exercised? And that's still a point of debate in Catholic Orthodox dialogue today. Okay. All right, so from the 16th through the 18th century, is really a time of union. That the Holy Spirit is very much at work where lots of Christians, both laity and clergy in different parts of the Eastern Christian world, want to see a restoration of union. Sometimes political reasons were mixed in, sometimes economic reasons were mixed in, but the overarching theme is the same. We are incomplete if we are not united somehow to the See of Peter. So the first one was the Union of the Chaldean Church in 1552, which is in Iraq, Persia, and Syria, and now because of the persecutions there all over Europe and the Americas as well. The Brest Union of 1596 was a large part of the Orthodox Church of Kiev in Poland, Lithuania, Commonwealth, modern Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, and Latvia. They originally were all signing up for the union, and then there was conflict in some of the eparchies, and bishops backed out at the last minute, so it was only part of the church. The Union of Marcha was a much smaller union of Serbs living in the Žumberak region of modern Croatia, and which this church still exists today. In 1630, we have the Union of the Armenians in Lviv in Galicia, where their archeparchy is united. And then 40-some years later, this long process of a union of the Armenian Apostolic Church in Transylvania, in modern Romania. Then, a few years after that, 1698, is the union for the Romanians in Transylvania. Again, was the whole church signed up, but then politics got involved, and a large part of them pulled out. The Melkite Patriarchate of Antioch in 1724, a Catholic patriarch was elected. A number of bishops objected. They wanted one aligned with Constantinople, and the church was split in half. And then in 1783, the Union of the Syriac Christians, modern Syria, Lebanon, and the Tur Abdin region in southern Turkey. Same thing, a pro-Catholic patriarch is elected, but other bishops objected, and so the church was divided. So all of these, are unions of people who see the value of being united with the Holy See of Rome. All of them, though, is part of their churches. Right? It's never the whole thing. There's even for some of the Armenians, there were some parishes that held back. Okay. All right, so those churches exist now today. Right? The Chaldeans have two dioceses in America. The Maronites have two eparchies in America. The Melkites have a national eparchy, as do the Romanians. The Syriac. The Union of Brest results in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, and they have the Metropolia of Philadelphia. And then the Armenian Catholics have the Eparchy of Our Lady of Narek. And here in the Phoenix area, there are 3 Chaldean parishes. In fact, those of you who are from St. Thomas Church in Gilbert, your church is used on Sundays by one of the Chaldean communities. St. Joseph Church, the Maronites, St. John of the Desert for the Melkites. And then Dormition of the Mother of God for the Ukrainian Greek Catholics. So, like our church, everybody is spread around the world from the Eastern Catholics. Okay. All right, so why the drive for the union? First of all, there was a strong, authentic desire to see the restoration of the United Church. It was embarrassing. It was embarrassing in Muslim countries to have different Christians competing with one another, not in communion with one another, not even talking to one another sometimes. They wanted to have everything back together. Under Islam, a lot of oppression for Christians, still true today. Islam calls for everyone to become Muslim. And a united front against fundamentalist Islam was really important. And at the time we're talking about, they were getting hit with those kind of waves. Islam goes through these phases like what we've been experiencing in our time for the last 30, 40 years. The decay of orthodoxy, the scandal of the Patriarchate in Constantinople. The Turkish government would confirm a patriarch and then depose him and call for another patriarch. And then the guy who was deposed, if he raised enough money, the Sultan would put him back in office. Again, very embarrassing and humiliating in front of the Muslims. And one of their patriarchs actually embraced the Calvinist heresy. And he was replaced at least 3 times and finally was killed. So that was, a big issue. The church in Constantinople was so disrupted. The collapse of classical education. Right? The great teaching was no longer taking place on a large scale in the Near East because of Islamic rule. Whereas the Roman Catholics who were coming there as merchants and opening their own parishes, they had flourishing theological and secular academies. It was very impressive for the local Christians. And the French, offered to protect local Christians as well and intervene on their behalf if they were Catholic. Politics. The Church of Moscow at this time, Peter the Great took over the Russian Orthodox Church. He wanted to update everything. The boyars had to have their beards cut and dress in Western-style clothing and so forth. And his patriarch, Nikon, introduced liturgical reforms that were rejected by large masses of the ordinary people and clergy, called Old Belief. So the Church of Moscow was torn apart. In Hungary, the Kingdom of Hungary, there was a lot of persecution by the Orthodox, by the Protestant landlords and Unitarian landlords who would interfere with church life, as we'll see. To all of the people in these different regions, the West and the Diocese of Rome, the Holy See, represented advances. This is the time of not the Renaissance, but moving towards the Enlightenment. Great advances in theology, in preaching, in religious studies, responding to the Reformation, secular sciences, new technology coming from the West. People in the East looked around and said, we are so far behind in everything. Peter Mohila, when he opened his theological academy in Kiev for the Orthodox Church, he modeled it on a Jesuit college and introduced the study of Latin, because Latin opened the door to Western learning. Okay. All right. So Royal Hungary. I had somebody complain once. He says, everything you talk about is Hungary. Why is it all in Hungary? Well, this is why. So the Kingdom of Hungary is all of this. The green part here is the Principality of Transylvania. These brown areas, this is the areas that the Turks had conquered. They were pushing north and northwest, heading towards Vienna. If Vienna fell, that opened the door to all of Western Europe, and history would have been changed. The Hungarian kingdom was united politically with the Austrians from the Holy Roman Empire. Austria is over here. When the last king of Hungary died, in his will, he stipulated that the crown of St. Stephen would pass to the Habsburg royal family, which became the imperial family of Austria. And so the Turks are pushing up here. Subcarpathian Rus, as we'll see, is over in here and the territory of our church. But a large part of it was in Transylvania. So it was divided. The territory of the Upper Kingdom of Kosovo was split. And this is very typical of what we're talking about. All right. That's a typical wooden church, multi-domed, the cross in the churchyard, cemetery nearby. It's very much a church of ordinary peasants, except for the Greeks. The Greeks were a small merchant class that never got involved in the Union. They remained under Constantinople. Okay. All right. So the Ruthenian Church within the kingdom. So they're called Greek Christians because they follow the Byzantine rite, which came from Constantinople. So if you ever get to go to Eastern Europe, Father Saboch and and Bishop Artur over there, known as Greek Catholics. Right? So it's focused on the southern slopes of the Carpathian Mountains of Subcarpathian Rus, which is now Ukraine and Slovakia, and the Hungarian plain. Their center was in Mukachevo. The bishop lived at the monastery of St. Nicholas, and the bishop was usually a monk elected by the priests from the congregation living at St. Nicholas. One of our big distinguishing things is congregational singing. That the Prostopinja chant, the chant that we use every day in church, is Prostopinja. And that's a unique feature that we kept up congregational singing long after it disappeared from the Church of Constantinople. And the connection was still to the Patriarch of Constantinople, okay, who was under Turkish rule after 1453. Okay. All right. Who are the people? Farmers. They're ordinary peasant people. Beautiful styles of clothing for the Highlanders, for the Lowlanders, for the Boyko, the Hutsul, the Lemko, all different kinds of clothing. Beautiful woodworking, not just in the churches, but in things like this with the great crosses along the roadsides. But also very multi-ethnic. Okay. So, most of the population was Rusin, what is known as Ruthenian, right? They call themselves Rusini, right? And the Latins call them Rutheni, all right, Ruthenians. The Slovaks, Romanians, Serbs, these are people who fled north to escape the Turks and settled in northern Hungary. Germans in villages that switched from Latin Rite to Byzantine Rite. They liked Byzantine services. And so there are a number of villages that did that were ethnically German. And then much later on, we have converts from Judaism and Protestantism from the 18th century on. Okay. So the territory was huge. Huge. Now, what's purple here is the territory that was ethnically Rusin in 1910 at the time of the last census in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Everything in here and down through here and all of that is the Eparchy of Mukachevo. When one of the bishops decided he needed to visit every parish, it took him 38 days to ride on a horse from down here to over here. It's a long ride. So gigantic territory, multi-ethnic. All of these towns that are marked here, they're all major parish centers, right? And still are today. All right, so this is all, if you ever get to go over there, which I highly recommend, this is the Greek Catholic territory. It'd be very interesting. I was in Mariupol at the Basilica, and I was going over, and I was going to offer liturgy, and I was talking to the Hungarian priest in German, and he was carrying a box of Latin hosts, and I said, why are you bringing those? And he said to me, oh, because you're from America. You're Latin Catholic. And I said, no, I'm Greek Catholic. And we got to the sacristy. He threw open the door and he yells to everybody, he's Greek! He's ours! And that's a really cool feeling when because all of you know we're constantly having to explain ourselves, right? And not there. It was home. Okay. This is the monastery of St. Nicholas. And this was the home of the Bishop of Mukachevo. And this is the church itself of St. Nicholas. This is built after the Union, this building and everything. But it's been there for a long, long time on Union Hora, the Black Mountain. Okay. So this is in Mukachevo town. The monastery is on the hill up above the town. The original church in town was a wooden church, probably something like this, although this is Lemko style. But I thought it was a good picture of showing the wood. And then here is the actual proto-cathedral, the original cathedral of the Eparchy of Mukachevo. The tower was added on in 1834, but a big stone church. So the bishop would come out of St. Nicholas, to celebrate services down here. Okay, which is important for our story. All right, so how old is the eparchy? Traditionally, it's considered to be descended from the missionaries of the Syro-Methodian mission from the 9th century. After the fall of Great Moravia, that a number of disciples went east along the Carpathian Mountains and evangelized the people living there. What's really interesting is they did not look for chieftains. There were no nobility really to speak of. They went from village to village to village. Right? It's a church of the people. Chora is where the mount is, the black mountain from the black colors of the monk's habit. In 1240, at the time of the Mongol invasion, there are documents that say the St. Nicholas Monastery was considered to be ancient. All right, so it probably goes back a long, long time. The earliest written history, Luke from the monastery, is recognized by the king of Hungary, King Matthias Hunyadi, in 1458 as the presbyter Rutenus, right, the priest of the Ruthenians, giving him rights to vineyards that would produce altar wine and tithes from 2 villages. And then in 1491, Bishop Ivan is recognized by the king according to ancient custom. So again, saying it goes back a long time. And then in the 1550s, in this time frame, all of the parishes from the Matamoros region, which was Romanian, all the way up to the modern Slovak territory, is all recognized as being under the Eparchy of Mukachevo, that huge territory. Okay. So, who consecrated and who had authority over the bishops of Mukachevo? This is St. Sophia in Kiev, and this is the Romanian Greek Catholic Cathedral in Transylvania. Now, the thing is, why I put this in there is there are attempts nowadays to claim that Mukachevo was a suffragan eparchy of Kiev and belonged to Kiev, which is not true. Some of the bishops were consecrated by the metropolitans of Kiev, but the vast majority of the bishops, of the priests who were elected to be a bishop, went to the Romanians. Why? The Romanians were next door. They're literally next. You just had to go along the Carpathians into Transylvania, into Moldavia and Wallachia, and there you are. You have bishops. And they were great friends of the Ruthenian Church. So getting over to Kiev was much harder, greater distance, and so it never had authority over our territory. Okay. So what happens? These are the influences towards the Union of Uzhhorod. The steady loss of contact with Constantinople. Right? As the Turkish armies advanced, they had a very bad habit of slaughtering people or enslaving people. Huge sections of the Balkans are depopulated, and it became very dangerous and very hard to get to Constantinople at all. The Union of Brest, a partial union, as I said, with a detailed agreement to preserve the Byzantine Slavonic Rite in its entirety. That was very appealing to the Church of Mukachevo. 1611, at the other end of the territory in Croatia, the Union of Marcha, where the Serbian bishop unites with the Holy See. And then you have the Reformation. The Reformation in the Kingdom of Hungary produces Lutherans, Calvinists, and then Unitarians. Unitarians deny the Holy Trinity. That's what their name means. They believe in God without any 3 persons. All of these are represented in the landowning classes. All of the villages and parishes of the Mukachevo eparchy were owned by landlords. Right? A number of very powerful families and then lots of lesser families. And the landlords would assign bailiffs to run the estate that belonged to the particular family. And the villages were part of the estate. The Rákóczi family ruled in Transylvania, that big green territory. They became Calvinists, and they wanted everybody under their rule to become Calvinists. So they had conflict with the Unitarians, but they wanted the Orthodox, definitely, to convert. So Bishop Basil III of Mukachevo and Bishop Gregory were both imprisoned by the prince. Bishop Petronius, who followed those two, was exiled to Poland, and that's where he met Uniates for the first time. He meets Greek Christians who are united to Rome. Got it? Okay, next one. So, another great influence, what I just alluded to, Ius Patronatus. The landowners were tried to force Orthodox villages into their religion. Ius Patronatus also held the right of the patron, also held that they could appoint or remove the pastor. This is what happens in the United States in the 1890s through the 1930s. Trustees of our churches said, we have inherited Ius Patronatus, being in America. We have the right to remove or hire a priest. What they would try to do then was pull out the Orthodox priest and put in an Orthodox priest who was going to go along with their heresy, or a Protestant minister entirely. The Jesuit missionaries. Now, there's a legend that's very alive on the internet that the Jesuits created the Union of Uzhhorod. They didn't want a union. The Jesuits wanted all of these Orthodox people to become Roman Catholic. They didn't believe you were saved if you were still a Greek Christian. So they were going in and preaching this to people. The landlords treated the Orthodox peasants very, very badly in the Kingdom of Hungary. It was awful. And the bailiffs would come on the various holy days. And remember the calendar, they were on old calendar, so they were several days behind the Western calendar. They would literally drag the priest away from the altar in the middle of liturgy to show how much power they had, right? And forbid the people from worshiping. You know, the old canon law, and still, on a holy day of obligation and on Sundays, you're not to do servile labor. So it was a sin. Literally, it's a sin for them to have to go out into the fields on a holy day. They're supposed to be in church, vespers, matins, liturgy, and then go home. It's a day to be with the family, right? The bailiffs didn't want that. They wanted more work days from these people. All right, 1614, two of the most powerful families returned to the Catholic Church, Esterházy and Drugeth. The Esterházys still exist today. They wanted their villages in the western and central parts of the eparchy to convert based on the Union of Florence and the Union of Brest. And then there's the desires of the parish priests in the villages. They want their boys to get an education. They only knew they had to teach their boys Slavonic themselves. To read and write in Slavonic and to celebrate the services and the sacraments. That's all they had. They didn't have good theological education. The kids in their parishes were not getting religious education, and they weren't getting a secular education. There was nobody to do that. The landlords didn't care about that. They didn't want an educated class. They want these people to work. Right? They don't want upward mobility. But the priests did. Right? They know that they don't know a lot, especially when the Jesuits and the Franciscans start showing up. They're lost in debates. Okay. Orthodox priests and bishops were appointed by the prince. They had to be guided. All of them had to be guided, in quotes, by Calvinist ministers who were appointed as superintendents. And they start pressuring, first to get rid of infant communion, then to stop people from venerating icons, then to stop praying to the saints and holding molebens and so forth in honor of the saints. And gradually the idea was to bring them into the Reformed Church. And then in Humene and Stropkov, the Jesuits and the Franciscans went to the local landlords and used their authority to convert entire villages into the Latin Church, forced them into the Latin Church. And this went on for a long time, this attitude of, you're not fully Catholic unless you're Latin. So they all agreed something has to be done. It can't go on. Okay. So what happens? Peter Pasmani, Father? Pasmani. He was a great Jesuit missionary. He converted 30 of the noble families of Hungary back into the Catholic Church. The Esterházys and the Drugas become very enthusiastic Catholics as a result. And they owned a lot of the villages in the center and west of Mukachevo. The imperial family of the Habsburgs, they favored a peaceful union. They did not want a forced union. That had failed everywhere else. They didn't want that. And they liked the Ruthenian people. Empress Maria Theresa sent her son, the future Joseph II, to inspect the territories. He attended liturgy at St. Nicholas Monastery, and he wrote to his mother how impressed he was with the beauty of the singing, the piety of the people, their love for the church. The Habsburgs kept up that connection with our church right to the very end of the empire. And in fact, when Bishop, not Takac, Ivancho was enthroned in Pittsburgh, the Empress Zita and her children, who had been exiled from Austria, they came for his consecration, and they were seated on thrones in the cathedral where the liturgy took place. So it's a very strong connection that takes place with the imperial family. Okay. So here's the seeds of the union. So Bishop Petronius got sent to Poland, Lithuania, right? He comes back with 2 monks, Ivan Hryhorovich and Basil Tarasevich. They were in contact with St. Joseph Akwintsevich and Metropolitan Joseph Rudzki. And they wrote of him, Bishop Basil, too, is one of us, but not yet completely. These are the 2 great leaders of the union in Poland, Lithuania. Poland, Lithuania was the second largest country in Europe at the time, from Latvia all the way down to where the Turks were invading in Ukraine. So they were the leaders of the United Church. All 3, Petronius and then Ivan and then Basil, ended up being consecrated by Romanian Orthodox bishops for Mukachevo, even though the Orthodox bishops knew they had very strong pro-Catholic sympathies. In 1634, Bishop Basil, this is quotes from the chronicles of the time, was torn violently from the altar and dragged through the streets of Mukachevo, clothed in the same vestments, and put into chains because of his Catholic sympathies. So imagine you've gone to church for a holy day. And you all know how beautiful our hierarchical liturgies are. And you go to church, and here comes the bailiff and soldiers down from the castle, and they drag your bishop through the mud. The streets weren't paved. Through the mud, up the hill, into the castle, and down into a dungeon, and locked him up, and basically threw the key away. And he was charged with treason to the prince because he was going to unite with Rome. So this is when the Rákóczi family installs rival bishops under Calvinist control. And now, after 800 years, the priests are afraid this is it. This is going to be the end of our church. Okay. So this is the castle of Ungvar. Right? Var means fortress in Hungarian. Ung, it was the name of the river. Right? In Slavonic, it's Uzh. So, and town in Slavonic is Horod, so Uzhhorod. Okay? So sometimes you'll see Ungvar in documents. That's why I'm saying it. So this was what the castle looked like at the time. This is the Church of St. George. And these are the ruins of the Church of St. George. It was never rebuilt after it burned down. And this is where the union takes place, is in the church, all right, inside the fortress. Okay. So everything came together beautifully for them. Bishop George Lipai was a great advocate for the Ruthenian Church, and he wrote to Rome about them and about the increase of desire for restoration of communion with Rome. He becomes the Archbishop of Esztergom, the primate of the Roman Catholic Church in the Kingdom of Hungary. Bishop George Jakusic becomes the Bishop of Eger, the closest Latin diocese to our territory. And he was a great friend of the Ruthenians. He really liked the Rusin people and the Greek Rite. On April 24th, at that time, April 24th was the Feast of St. George. April 23rd in the Kingdom of Hungary was the Feast of St. Adalbert. So if you ever, somebody says, oh, you people didn't even know. I had somebody tell me this. You don't even know when St. George's Day is. I said, yes, I do, but so did they. They had to change it because Adalbert was a big saint in Royal Hungary. So on April 24th, 63 priests from villages under the control of the Drugath and Esterhazy families come to Uzhhorod to sign the Act of Union. They came from Uzh, Zemplén, and Sarish counties. And they met at St. George's Church at the castle above the town. Now what happens is they're incarnated. They are accepted into the Diocese of Eger under Bishop George, right, as Catholic clergy united to Rome under their own archdeacons. These guys were not deacons, they're priests, but this was the title they're given. Each archdeacon had authority over a certain number of parishes. Okay. So this is the long-lost text of the Union. On this side, we see the Union in Latin, and then down here and on the back are the signatures of all the priests in Slavonic. Again, right? Some guy, Orthodox person came up to me and said, see, you people are so Latinized, even your Union was in Latin. Well, if we go to the next slide, it is in Latin, but why? Nobody spoke Latin as their native tongue, right? You have 20 languages in the Kingdom of Hungary. Who are we going to use? They used Latin because nobody could get mad. They even had to debate in Parliament in Latin. This is the translation. We, the undersigned, declare in our names and those of our successors that recognizing the most illustrious and reverend master, Vladika, Bishop, George Yakusic, Bishop of Eger, and his legitimate successors in the Catholic See of Eger, for our true and legitimate bishops, ordinary, prelate, and diocesan, promise and pledge to him and to them every deserved distinction and obedience insofar as his or their spiritual and ecclesiastical jurisdiction requires, with our faithfulness and oath mediating, having no one as our ordinary bishop apart from him named, or those named as most illustrious or reverend bishop or bishops, as long as we abide in his or their diocese. Go to the next one, please. Moreover, we will attempt by no agreement without his or their consent to undertake any sacred ordination for those dismissed, to change parishes, or do anything which would contravene his jurisdiction. Basically what, the situation of priests in any diocese would be. We pledge that we will have those bishops as our superiors, subordinates or suffragans, vicars or archdeacons, whom the aforementioned most illustrious, most reverend bishop or his successors put forward as our true and legitimate superiors, with our Christian faithfulness intervening. With a view to the greater steadfastness and force of this matter, we have written this letter, confirmed by the signature of our hands and by us seal, Union of Uzhhorod, April 24th, 1646. There's only one seal. There were not 63 because they were poor. None of the priests could afford a seal. It's just the bishop's seal. Okay. So the document, what happens is this. See, as we'll see, there's another union a few years later. This got lost, and this is why it got lost. They only had one. They didn't make copies. Bishop Yakusic was the brother of Countess Anna Drugath from that big, new, powerful family that had returned to the church. So, as I said, signatures are in Slavonic. Now, the archive of the Drugath family was kept in Humene, but they died out. So there was really nobody taking care of things. And a priest from Slovakia, Father Juraj Glados, he found it while he was looking for something else entirely. So he found it while I was working on my history book. And he says, it may not have been under the best of care. And then he explains what happened. And I said, yeah, no kidding, it's not under the best of care. not only was everything kind of jumbled together, but during World War II, the whole archive was dumped out into a street in Jemene when the Red Army was invading. And all the papers were caught in the battle between the Red Army and the German Wehrmacht. So whatever survived went into the mansion. But then the mansion caught fire in 1947. And then what was left from that mess went to the State Archive. And it's divine providence that the thing has survived all this time. So the Union was gradually accepted beyond the original territory. Went into Uzh, Ung, Zemplin, Sharish, but then into Spish, Abash, Torona, Saboch, Borshod, and Gurmar counties. Maramaros, Berek, Ugocha, and Satmar, big territories, they remained under the Rakotsi family, all right? And anybody who became Catholic was persecuted. The thing is that the role of the bishop of Mukachevo was he was an ethnarch as well as bishop. He was the leader of his people. And nobody was going to accept a bishop in charge unless he had residence at St. Nicholas Monastery. That's what they wanted to see. So even though the guys being imposed by the prince had Calvinist leanings, they weren't going to all follow until that happened. And then the deaneries of these new united parishes, they stay, as we saw, under the Latin bishop of Eger in terms of jurisdiction. Next one. Okay. Why in Latin? Neutral language, right? Country was very multi-ethnic. There were now priests in the diocese of Eger. So the union spreads west and south, right? Can't go east very far. And so by 1650, 4 years, you have 100 priests and 20,000 faithful. Why was the union important in Mukachevo? It was a mess, all right, without the being so isolated and on their own. Parishes were not well organized. Sometimes you had 5 priests living in one village and then other villages with no priest. People lived an hour or 2 away by foot from a church. There were the marriage and divorce laws were being ignored. There were priests that were in a second or even third marriage. And those had to be cleaned up. They were going to be given immunity to the priests so that they didn't have to work as serfs for the landlords. No more would they be working in the fields. They would work their own field, the field that belonged to the church. But they weren't going to have to go out, and they couldn't be dragged away from the altar anymore, right? And then the monks who accepted the union, they reorganized, all right, under Jesuit influence. And this is where we get the Basilian Fathers from, the Order of St. Basil the Great, because they followed the rule of St. Basil. Okay. Now, the expansion. So 1648, Bishop Basil Tarasevich, who did not sign it, the original union is only signed by priests, right? He reaffirms to the imperial family his personal conversion to the Catholic faith. He dies 3 years later. He's succeeded by Parthenius, one of the guys who came with him from Galicia. And 370 of 400 Orthodox priests voted for him. Basil on his deathbed asked that they would vote for Parthenius, right, because he would lead the whole eparchy into union. Parthenius goes into the Romanian land. He's consecrated in Moldavia by Orthodox bishops. They know he's Catholic. They know he wants to lead union. That's fine with them. He is recognized by the nuncio, the papal nuncio, the Pope's ambassador in Vienna, as both apostolic visitator of the Ruthenians and, which is important, a united bishop with full jurisdiction, full authority, not as a vicar of the diocese. This was what the Jesuits and religious orders, other religious orders, and many Latins wanted. They did not want bishops with full authority. They wanted to make the Greek bishops vicars without control, where they would have the authority. And that comes because of the first act of union. They were incarnated into Eger. And then the center and the east of the eparchy remain Orthodox. Okay. So, 1652, 6 years later. The guys have learned now, after 6 years of people coming into the church, joining the church. Priests now number 400, so they've quadrupled. They're still facing persecution by Calvinist or Unitarian landlords. And they affirm in the Union of 1652, we believe all and everything that our Holy Mother, the Roman Church, bids us believe. We acknowledge that the Most Holy Father, Innocent X, is the universal pastor of the Church of Christ and our pastor. And we, with our successors, desire and wish to depend on him in everything. With, however, the addition of these conditions, that it be permitted for us to retain the right of the Greek Church, to have a bishop elected by ourselves, which they had been doing, for centuries, and confirmed by the Apostolic See, and to have free enjoyment of ecclesiastical immunities, that they be recognized by the government, by the landlords, by the bailiffs, as being fully Catholic clergy equal to the Latin Catholic clergy. That's very important for their social, not their social standing, their legal standing, all right, that they would be respected by law. So they learned from 1646, you got to be more specific. Okay. 1661, Princess Sofia Bartoldi Rákóczi returns to the Catholic faith, and that puts an end to the persecution of united parishes in the territories under their rule. The imperial family, the Habsburgs, personally gave vestments to Bishop Parthenius, outfitted him with everything that he would need as a bishop so he would look proper coming into St. Nicholas Monastery. And the Basarab family, we have Basarabs now in America that are descended from this family. They were a noble Romanian family from Transylvania, and they built the new church of St. Nicholas at the monastery. The Serbian parishes in northern Hungary united. All of these assimilated into the ethnic Hungarian identity. The famous village of Mariupol, where the icon of Our Blessed Lady has wept 3 times, was one of these villages. In 1720, the Union of Maramureș. That's all the parishes are now united, again, into one eparchy, all united with Rome, and the parallel Orthodox jurisdiction ends. It's over with the last bishop. So the entire Ruthenian Church is in full communion with the Holy See. By this time, the word uniate, which was coined originally in Poland and Lithuania to designate Byzantine and Greek Christians who were united with Rome, simply from the Latin word, had become a term of derision by the Orthodox, a mockery, implying that you weren't really Eastern anymore as a uniate. So the Empress Maria Theresa, she intervened, and she says, no, we're going to give that up. We're going to use the phrase Greek Catholic. And so that's where it comes from. Okay. So these are the daughter churches from the Union. Križevci is descended from the Union of Marcha. This is in Croatia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Slovenia. The Church of Hajdúdarog, now the Metropolia of Hungary, the eparchy that was founded in 1912. Križevci eparchy was founded in 1777. The Exarchate of Cyril and Methodius in Toronto, founded in 1980. The St. Nicholas of Ruski Kereštor. This is a big Rusin village in Serbia. Lots of Rusins, before they came to the Americas, they moved south. Greek Catholic Rusins and Slovaks moved south to repopulate the territories that the Turks had wiped out. And so they built new villages. So that's the eparchy now in Serbia. The eparchy of Prešov, now for the Metropolia of Slovakia, was founded in 1818. And then in the United States, Munhal, the Exarchate of Munhal in 1924, that's our church. The Metropolia of Pittsburgh was erected in 1965 as a sui juris church, as a self-governing church. We hold the status of a self-governing church. Right? We're not connected to, we're not under the jurisdiction of any of the Europeans, even though we have kept up our relationship with them, but none of them hold authority over here. And then the Exarchate of Prague in the Czech Republic in 1996. So it's a big church. It's over 1 million people. This is our church in America. Here we are. That nice little territory that Bishop Artur has. Takes you what? Yeah, if you got to ride a horse, this would take you more than 38 days. It's just huge. This is Parma, Pittsburgh, and Passaic. When Rome did this, all right, the priests who were serving in Texas at the time, they came for an event that we were holding. They said, why aren't we under your eparchy? Culturally, we have nothing to do with this. They have no idea what burritos are, up here. And I said, Rome has no idea just how big America is. I am convinced of that. So, but this is the church we have now. So it's huge. All right, why does it matter? Our eparchy is a direct descendant of this union. All right, the people who moved across the United States and founded these parishes decades ago, they were either both spouses or one spouse coming out of descendants of immigrants who came to America and were holding fast to this tradition. We continue to use the Prostopinia chant. We continue to use Ruthenian customs. We do things that no other Eastern church does, right, that came out of the land of the Carpathians. We have a record, as those who came during Lent know, of unbroken loyalty to the Holy See. We have no bishops that apostatized. None of our bishops ever went to Orthodoxy. None. In the face of terrible persecution and torture by the communists, none of them ever broke. No bishop in America ever went to the Orthodox. Right? We are strongly loyal to the Holy See. And that's true for all of the eparchies, the other ones as well. A model for orthodoxy. How? I think, our union was achieved slowly. They did patient education, and they did slow expansion. When Orthodox missionaries would come up from Serbia to try and stir up trouble, the priests were educated enough that they could respond to them. The bishops could issue books and pamphlets that responded to them. And very few people would rally around those Orthodox missionaries. Not until the 1890s, when there was trouble in America, did you have Orthodox parishes open up in that territory. But the model of the union is no government was involved, right? The local noble families were involved, but the priests desired it. The priests knew they needed this. The bishops desired it. It wasn't being forced on them. And prayer, a lot of prayer, and a lot of study. We have to know our faith. We have to know what we're talking about. The people involved in that whole process from 1646 to 1720, they had a very clear idea of the importance of union with the Holy See of Peter. As Byzantine Catholics, as people attending Byzantine Catholic parishes, there are people on the internet who say we're Orthodox in union with Rome. That's very offensive to Orthodox. Either you're Orthodox or you're Catholic. That's just reality. You can be fully Eastern as any Carpatho-Russian Orthodox, probably even more so, and be fully Catholic. That's what all of the Eastern Catholic churches are supposed to be exemplifying. In Orientalium Ecclesiarum in 1965 at the Second Vatican Council, restored to us the right to evangelize the nations, to go out to all people and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. We are not, as you all know, we are not bound to any ethnic identity. We are bound to save souls. That's what we're bound to. That's our duty, to bring people to Jesus Christ through our Byzantine-Ruthenian tradition. What is Rome? It's a center of authority, obviously. Right? It's a center for teaching. It's a center for education. Things that happen in Rome ripple across the world. How many times have you watched on TV the election of the Patriarch of Moscow? 0. Or the Archbishop of Canterbury? Zero. Nobody cares in terms of the media world. But the Pope dies, everybody goes to Rome. Everybody goes to Rome. And it's live. You know, the black smoke comes up, it's live. Why? Even people that are not Catholic or even anti-Catholic, they know this Holy See of Peter is unique in its history and in its authority and its importance in the Christian world. And spiritual growth for the entire church. The whole church relies on the See of Peter, especially in the last couple of centuries, that the See of Peter has really grown into its role as a center for Christianity. And why is it? It's because we are here to fulfill the prayer of our Lord in John's Gospel, that all will be one. I have one flock, one shepherd, and that's what we want to be a part of. Okay, next. And that's it. Okay, there you go.